just as a very first kind of introduction, would love to understand who's in the audience. So maybe with a quick show of hands, tell us who is a developer here. Awesome. So who is a cloud developer? Who's developing cloud applications? Okay, about half of you. That's good. Are you on AWS? Anyone on AWS? Okay. Any other clouds? Okay. Good to know. That's super helpful. So we want to keep this talk a bit more conversational because I know it's one of the last talks of this conference. Starting off with the title, maybe. So cloud is a new mainframe, why the cloud hype does not reflect the dev reality. So at least for the second part, Waldemar, I could literally write a book about this. And there are so many reasons why it's sometimes really cumbersome to develop on my local machine against the cloud. But this cloud is a new mainframe. I'm not sure, maybe you can shed a light on that, because that to me doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, when I think of the mainframe, I basically think of this huge, big iron thing that maybe we ran some huge, big applications that are definitely very important. Who of you has ever developed in COBOL? I knew it. 2 people. Okay, right. Wonderful. So I guess everybody of us knows that still, although we don't develop it, those systems are still powering our day-to-day life in banking, in finance, and so on. So they are important. But in my mind, they're very different to the cloud. When I think of the cloud, I think of this land of endless opportunities. I have my microservices, tiny apps. I can do whatever I want. They can be as flexible as my yoga teacher and still be more flexible, which really is a hard statement. So how do those things really go together?
Yeah, and I really want to see that with the flexibility of your yoga teacher. But I think we're going to focus on the second part, the mainframe, in a bit. Maybe let's start first about the cloud experience and what you've experienced yourself personally in this developer experience for the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the very first times that I was developing cloud apps. It was during my studies. I had a part-time job and I was tasked to develop this AWS cloud app. And I was super excited. I came from the Java world. I developed a couple of applications. Everything worked always perfectly on my machine. Then I gave it to the DevOps team, and that's a different story, but let's focus on this one. So I basically was super excited. I started developing my app using a lot of services from AWS. So I was using databases, message queues, virtual machines, S3 buckets. So a lot of moving parts and dependencies that I initially had to integrate with before I really could get started. And this is where I really understood this is a bit different than traditional development and what I'm usually used to. So now figuring out how to integrate all of those, I kind of time passed by, like 1 hour later, after a while, I really figured out how it works. All dependencies were integrated. And now I was really excited to deploy my first cloud application. And then after a while, the excitement kind of boiled down to not being so excited anymore, because I saw I had to wait every time, every change that I made, I had to wait for it to be deployed to the cloud. So basically, I figured out very early on that the entire development experience in the cloud is completely different than when you develop locally. So I had every change that I made, and obviously I had to make a lot of changes because no code that we write is perfect from the get-go. Every iteration needed to be packaged, uploaded to the cloud, deployed there, run there, and every time it was taking a lot of time.
Yeah, I love the XKCD reference you have there. I think it's a slightly modified version. So we used to be compiling, it took a lot of time. And nowadays it's really kind of deploying the changes to the cloud, which is taking a lot of the developer efficiency, really, if you think about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I personally wasn't kind of sword fighting with my colleagues. I kind of started playing the yo-yo again, which is something that I used to do as a child. And I became really professional at it. I don't know if you guys realize, but in a lot of those bags, you get yo-yos. And I think that's for a good reason. Use them, you will need them. So about 2 hours later, finally, things were kind of resolved. Everything was running. So I was now basically still slightly exhausted from all the yo-yo playing, but things were running. So as a next step, I decided to create basically a feature branch with my changes and trigger a build. And of course, I was getting a red build initially as a very first thing.
Those things can happen, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, and the thing is that the cloud is basically this black box system, and it was really hard for me to figure out why this was happening. I mean, obviously, I thought, hey, I'm gonna call this Jeff Bezos guy and tell him to connect me to my team, so I can look into the internals of AWS Cloud and figure out what is happening there, that I need to make changes on my machine. Obviously, that didn't work out. Even as a 20-something, I figured that out early on.
Yeah, I definitely like the idea of calling Jeff Bezos for, can you please debug this for me? But in all seriousness, I think it seems like what you're describing is there's a fundamentally different experience when you develop against the cloud. It's a remote system. So previously you maybe had something like debuggers and IDEs and so on, and now you have this remote system. And what you can do is basically look at the logs, right? Is that what you were seeing?
Yeah, exactly. So now, first of all, I first wanted to figure out how do I attach my debugger. Didn't work because it wasn't running on my machine. So then I was like, okay, I need to use logs. I put log debugging on, which triggered another build. I got a bit frustrated over time. So at the end of the day, I finally got my logs. They were helpful, some of them. They were really helpful to get things going, but some logs were absolutely saying nothing at all to me. So I had to do a lot of Stack Overflow searching to figure out what this batch entry ID is not distinct actually means for me.
That sounds like a very obscure error message there, and I like the term Stack Overflow-based debugging. Essentially,
Yeah.
we're using there. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, that's pretty accurate. So after a couple of cycles of basically the Stack Overflow-based debugging, I think 5 hours passed. I had to do 15 to 20 deployments. Every time I had my wait times. In total, I had just waited over an hour, and it was all just taking so long because I had no insight into the system. To be fair, at the end, I wasn't like that happy anymore with the cloud project that I was developing.
Yeah, and I think the interesting point is now after kind of telling the story about the local cloud or the cloud development experience, maybe we can now sort of close the gap or the loop to the first part of the title, right? The mainframe. So if we take a quick look, what are mainframes, right? And we're by means no experts, but we just know from history and reading upon them. Developed in the 60s, these large monolithic systems are really powerful, and they're still used today in things like banking, insurance, and other applications. There's some modern racks here as you can use on the right-hand side. Here. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically the idea is that you have some kind of a time-sharing algorithm where multiple terminals can access the central system. You basically have these thin clients, and then they have access to this really powerful machine. So it makes a lot of sense from a sort of economies of scale perspective, right? Because they're powerful, you can run them in production workloads and so on. But if you think about the developer experience, and we're mostly all about sort of developer experience, it comes with some caveats that make things a bit challenging in that environment. Now, obviously, the world has moved on. If you can go to the next slide, please. The world has evolved. So nowadays, we're mostly not using mainframes anymore, even though they were great at the time. But the hardware locally has become much more powerful. Like our laptops today are really strong and powerful machines. The emergence of the World Wide Web has made everything much more decentralized, right? You have servers across the globe that are serving HTTP traffic, for example. And from a developer perspective, I think we really had this golden era. Some of you may still remember the LAMP stack, right? You had your Apache, MySQL, PHP running locally. You just basically were in control over everything on your single machine. You could iterate quickly and just push your changes to the server and deploy it. So that has changed a bit with the cloud, as outlined by Gerta, all these moving parts. But I think you want to maybe jump in there.
Yeah, honestly, I was just doing a quick search while we were speaking, and I figured out there are a lot of people on the internet actually making that comparison of mainframe versus cloud. So here's just an excerpt of a Hacker News user called Gigawatts. Obviously, take it with a grain of salt because everyone has their own opinions. But when you look at it, what they're really saying is that basically they're seeing the same story that I had with my local development on the cloud experience. So first of all, they had to submit their code to the system, the mainframe, where I had to submit it to the cloud. They got only print out logs back as a result to be able to debug things. It was really cumbersome and tedious to work with. And it was also incredible inefficient at the end of the day to work directly against the mainframe. And over time, apparently times changed, so we had more local development. So basically, also what other people are saying is that the cloud is really not providing those all local workstations. It's this closed source black box that we're having in both cases. There's very poor debugging experience, and we just have to work with logs all the time. So there are actually quite a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we're also not the only ones who say this. So I think generally there's like a trend between centralization and decentralization that is observable in the industry, right? We're starting from the mainframes, very centralized, and going very decentralized in the World Wide Web, and home computers even that are doing a lot of local computation. And now the pendulum is kind of swinging back into this very centralized world with cloud computing. And it's, again, sort of swinging back a bit with things like edge computing, or also if you think about decentralized finance applications, blockchains, and so on, right? So, but I think the main gist of this slide here is that it's really a pendulum that swings between centralization and decentralization, and the community is kind of trying to figure out ways for essentially a good developer experience for each of these worlds, and this is an ongoing process, really.
Yeah, and actually, kind of continuing my story from before, it was not just me that was struggling with developing those cloud apps. I remember also my development manager had a really big struggle, because after a while we wanted to be like as flexible as possible, so we had different feature branches. So there was one CI built per feature branch. At the end of the day, there was a sheer explosion of different environments that we're maintaining. It gave us a lot of flexibility, but we just forgot to turn those environments off when we didn't need them anymore. So one day my development manager basically got a call from the finance department that wasn't that nice. Apparently we had been way above our AWS spend, and that for months. And it's apparently not just us, it was basically everyone. When you look at recent reports, you can see that 35%, which is a huge number, 35% of the entire cloud spend is just waste. It's basically going into the air for nothing. That's $17.6 billion. I think there's better stuff that we can do with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Certainly I've seen this also with teams that I've worked with in the past. And people are clever. They come up with clever solutions. So for example, what we call Slack-based environment reservation, right? You may create something like a bot in a Slack integration, and you say, I want to reserve the staging environment or QA environment. And then you basically can use this environment exclusively for a certain period of time. So that is certainly quite, let's say, clever and good solution that works in a lot of cases. Maybe in a few cases we can even do better than that, right? So it's maybe not the end of our journey here to do Slack-based environment reservation. So overall, I think what we've tried to show here in this talk so far was some of the challenges that the developers are facing. So it's the efficiency when you think about the inner dev loop, which really defines building your code, testing it, debugging it, making some changes. So really this inner dev loop is really what defines you and your efficiency on a day-to-day basis. And this is really critical. Debuggability, thinking about remote execution of a cloud. There's almost like this barrier between local and remote. How can you bridge the gap between these two? And then things like resource conflict. So if multiple people are working in one environment, and there's inherently, naming conflicts, people are overriding each other's changes. So you have to have some sort of isolation also for iterating quickly. Next slide. So with all that in mind, if you had 3 wishes, Gerta, what would you wish for from a genie in a bottle, thinking about these aspects?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I think, first of all, I can boil it down to 2 wishes. I just want to see 2 things. First of all, I want to develop against something that looks and behaves like the cloud, where I know what's happening, and I want to have something where I can leverage my IDE and the debugging tools that I have to just figure out how to debug things quickly without having to wait for some external resources.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Any third wish, or?
If I have to come up with something, then maybe give it a name and give it to me in a way that I can share it with all of my friends and let everyone know about it.
Okay. All right. So you just get some stickers in addition. So you just these 2 wishes, and we're done with it. Sounds great. Okay. So just briefly reiterating a bit on the local versus remote, right? So local being your local, workstation wherever you do your development, and remote is the remote execution environment. Now, the traditional way of developing and testing applications is remote execution, right? So that's the natural way. You just push your changes to the cloud, they execute there, and you get application logs that you can look into. There's a few other approaches that have been coming up that are a bit more, let's say, tailor-made and specialized. So cloud proxies is one aspect. So essentially what changes is that your code is still executing in the remote environment, but it has the look and feel of a local execution. So maybe you have a local IDE, set your breakpoints, but all the execution is actually forwarded to a remote system. And then sort of the other end of the spectrum is local emulation, and this is essentially where LocalStack this is the approach that we take, where you literally try and keep everything on your local machine, including the execution of your cloud application. And again, like there might be shades of gray in between for things that are working well in one environment or another. Yeah, so what are your thoughts on the, if you think about the spectrum of these three, especially for smaller changes maybe that you need to do on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, I'm not operating what I'm building. I'm basically just building it. I don't know why I need to have the entire thing. It feels like having a sledgehammer to crack a nut when I use the resources that I need to run my application to just develop it. And those other approaches like cloud proxies, local emulation feel like a more fine-grained tool for the task at hand.
Interesting. Yeah, so certainly not sort of suitable for every task, but for certain specific tasks, you can use these specialized approaches. That makes a lot of sense. I agree. Just coming back again, just briefly cherishing this inner dev loop. I think this is one of the key insights from this talk. I think making sure that we can iterate quickly on the frequent changes that we're making a code change in the IDE. How does it reflect in my running application? This is really where a lot of the crux comes into play, I think.
So we've basically been seeing the things that we talked about here for a couple of years. We started LocalStack already in 2016 as an open source project, and it apparently hit a nerve. A lot of people were having a similar issue. We're now at over 160 million Docker pulls, and the growth has been really very, very skyrocketing recently. So there's definitely an issue out there for those problems that we're talking about. So just as a high-level overview, how we're thinking about this is that basically you have your application, and on your local machine, and in some next stages like your CI environment, where you don't need the full power of the cloud, you can still emulate everything, run everything against the APIs that we provided in an emulated fashion. And then just in the higher stages, you would then basically just flip the switch without having to make any code changes and run everything in the cloud when you need it. So basically I have the fine-grained tool for your day-to-day work and the big hammer for basically putting stuff out to the world.
Yeah, cool. I think one thing that helps is just small comparison. Speed is always interesting, obviously, in this whole world of agility, and we just put together like a comparison of spinning up an RDS Postgres database, for example, on your local machine with LocalStack versus in the real cloud. Now you might argue, okay, this is bit of a corner case, like how often do you spin up an RDS database and so on. But the more frequently tests are being executed, if they're executed in a CI/CD pipeline, then these quick cycles really do matter. So I think efficiency and speed is really one of the things that are very critical.
Alert, it stops now at 20 minutes.
Right. Cool. I think we might still have like just a few minutes, 2 minutes for like a very, very short demo. I think this might have been a bit dry so far. So I just want to show a quick application, and we're going to start up LocalStack here first. I'm in the terminal. Where's my mouse? Here. Just doing a LocalStack start. What that does is it spins up a Docker container, which you will see on the right-hand side in this other terminal window. And then I need to get back my browser. It's challenging. Okay. And I go to app.localstack.cloud. And what we're going to do is we're going to deploy a tiny sample application. If I can find my mouse here, it's called Quick Start. Okay, and this sample application we're going to deploy consists of a bunch of different resources. It has Lambda functions, it has a DynamoDB table, an SQSQ, a bunch of different resources that are just emulating, like it's a simple application that's just doing some backend processing. I think we have it on the slides, but I'm not able to switch the screen now. And you could see on the left-hand side, this application was now deployed. I can switch over to this view here. And what I can do now is I can just simply from the browser send the request here, if I can find it all the way down here. Yeah, send a sample request. So I've now sent the request to an API gateway, which is running in the container again. It's now in the status queued. Might be a bit small for you to read. Let me zoom in there. So now it's in status queued. It's now being processing in the background. So now the request is being processing, and in the end, it will just be finished. So now the processing is done. So again, like a very short example of what can be achieved, and this whole thing was running on the local machine. It never ever talked to the real cloud. And now if you think about, I want to make a change to this application and quickly redeploy it, so you can have very, very quick cycles to enable this. All right, so let me switch over, just again, showing this overview of the application, what it looked like. I hope I'm going to be able to do it. Whoops, where's the full screen? Oh, yeah. That's tricky now to get back to the presentation mode. Where is it? Just close this here. I think maybe Gerta, you can start with the wrap up and. Sorry?
I'll help you.
Do you know what it is? It's here. Okay, I got it. Okay. Awesome.
Let's move on.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, we just showed this application here. If you're interested, there's more details. We also have a developer hub where you can find more samples on how this actually works. Again, spin up a container, you have the things running locally, and it just helps you with iterating quickly. Wrapping up.
Yeah, so I hope this was interesting to you. So if you want to read up more on this, please visit us and hit us up. We do have a Slack community channel, so where we do also organize a couple of meetups that you can find on meetup.com and also announced in our Slack community. There you can have discussions with us. You find us on GitHub, obviously. We have discussion pages forum where you can discuss with the wider community. And most of all, there's a little QR code. So if this was interesting for you, you can obviously always start for free with the open source version. If you need some of the more advanced features that we're building, you can get them for free for 3 months with that QR code.
So with that, thank you so much for your attention. Hopefully there's some Q&A, and also happy to take questions after the talk. Thank you so much.
So while everyone scans the QR code, we have a very important question for you.
Okay.
How many engineers does it take to plug a computer with a screen?
At least 10.
Seriously, yeah, that was definitely a hiccup, but thanks for bearing with us. It's
on a serious note, you showed an example with AWS, and I think the most common question is, when is local-stack, or do you plan to have integrations with other cloud vendors? How is your integration with Azure? So yeah, what are your plans on that one?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we get that often. We personally would love to do it as soon as possible, but obviously you can think AWS is already like such a beast in itself. But if there's a bigger case and you work for a larger company and that's really important to you, let us know. There may be some ways we can collaborate.
And we have a similar question. I'm not sure if this answers it, but it says, can you give an example what local stack does, which is not an emulation of AWS? So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think that the emulation is kind of the core layer that we provide as the foundation. And on top of that, we're building team collaboration features, for example. So we make it easy for you to take a snapshot of the state of your instance and then share it with your team members, for example. So, and that kind of redefines the way how you can interact with team members, collaborate, do state management and versioning over time, and these kind of things. So I think we're kind of moving from the emulator up on higher tiers there.
So thank you, Gerta and Waldemar.